Eleanor Voss had lived long enough to know that the cruelest things people say are almost always delivered with a smile. She'd learned that particular lesson at 34, at 67, and again at 82, each time from someone who claimed to love her. But it was on the morning of her 88th birthday, sitting alone in the sterile waiting room of her divorce attorney's office, that Eleanor finally understood something her grandmother had tried to tell her 7 decades ago. The things that are truly yours can never be taken from you. They can only be revealed. The divorce had been Maurice's idea, which was perhaps the most honest thing he'd done in their 21 years of marriage. He'd sat across from her at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in April, his coffee untouched, his hands folded with the careful deliberateness of a man who'd rehearsed this moment many times, and told her he was leaving. He was 79 years old, and he was leaving an 88-year-old woman for a 61-year-old woman named Diane, who taught ceramics classes at the Community Arts Center, and who, according to Maurice, truly understood him in ways Eleanor never had. Eleanor had looked at him across the breakfast table she'd set every morning for 21 years, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not devastation, not rage, something quieter and more complicated, something that felt almost like the release of a breath she'd been holding for a very long time. She didn't cry. She nodded slowly, asked if he'd like her to move out or if he planned to, and when he said he'd already arranged to stay with Diane while they sorted out the legalities, she'd said simply, "Very well, Maurice," and poured herself another cup of coffee. Her daughter from her first marriage, Patricia, called within an hour, which meant Maurice had already been on the phone. "Mom, are you all right?" Patricia asked, her voice tight with worry and something else, something that sounded uncomfortably like embarrassment. Being left by your husband at 88 carries a particular social sting that Eleanor recognized immediately. "I'm perfectly fine," Eleanor said. "Actually, I'm better than fine. I'm thinking about what comes next." "What comes next," Patricia said carefully, "is that you need to be practical. You're 88 years old, Mom. You can't live alone in that house. It's too big, too expensive to maintain. Maybe this is actually an opportunity to think seriously about assisted living. The Meadows on Riverside has an excellent reputation, and I've already spoken to someone there who—" "You've already spoken to someone," Eleanor repeated. "Just exploring options." Patricia's voice had taken on the bright, forced quality it got when she was determined to steer Eleanor towards something Eleanor didn't want. "You have to think realistically about your situation." "My situation," Eleanor said, "is that I've just been given the most unexpected gift of my 88 years. I'll call you later, Patricia." She'd hung up before her daughter could respond, and then she'd sat for a long time in the kitchen of the house she'd shared with Maurice, listening to the silence and thinking about her grandmother. Rosalind Voss had been the kind of woman who took up space unapologetically in a time when women were expected to make themselves small. She'd been an artist, a gardener, an amateur botanist, a voracious reader, and an absolutely terrible cook who'd somehow made every meal feel like a celebration. She'd lived alone in a house in the small Hudson Valley town of Crestwood, New York, from the time Eleanor's grandfather died in 1962 until her own death in 1989, and she'd been, Eleanor had always known, the most genuinely free person she'd ever met. When Eleanor was a young woman, her grandmother had taken her hands across a kitchen table, very much like the one Eleanor now sat at alone, and said, "I'm going to leave you something when I die, Ellie, something that has been in our family for a long time. Something that looks like nothing from the outside, but holds everything on the inside. Promise me you'll go there when you need to remember who you are." Eleanor had promised, the way young people promise things to old people they love, meaning it completely in the moment, and then letting it drift into the comfortable fog of things not urgently needed. She'd inherited the property when Rosalind died, a house and its surrounding land in Crestwood, and she'd paid its modest property taxes faithfully for 35 years through 2 marriages and multiple moves without ever returning to it. It had sat there in the back of her mind and her filing cabinet, that promise made across a kitchen table, waiting. She'd told herself she'd go back someday when the children were grown, when things settled, when life gave her a moment of stillness. But life doesn't volunteer stillness. Apparently, sometimes it has to be forced upon you by a 79-year-old man who's fallen in love with a ceramics teacher named Diane. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Maurice's attorney was aggressive and thorough, which Eleanor found almost admirably straightforward compared to the passive aggression she'd endured for years. They divided the house, the accounts, the furniture, the accumulated material evidence of 21 years, lived alongside each other but perhaps not truly together. Eleanor received what was fair, neither generous nor punitive, and she walked out of the final settlement meeting on a gray November afternoon feeling lighter than she had in years. Patricia was waiting outside the attorney's office, having appointed herself escort through the proceedings, whether Eleanor wanted an escort or not. She had a list. Eleanor could tell by the look on her face, that organized, purposeful expression that meant Patricia had been planning and researching and making calls on Eleanor's behalf without being asked. "I've set up a tour of the meadows for Thursday," Patricia said, falling into step beside her. "I think once you see it, you'll understand why it makes sense. It's not like the old nursing homes, Mom. It's more like a resort with medical support. Your own apartment, activities, a chef who actually—" "I'm going to Crestwood," Eleanor said. Patricia stopped walking. She turned to look at Eleanor with the expression she'd been perfecting since she was 7 years old, the particular combination of concern and exasperation that Eleanor had always privately thought of as Patricia's "I know better than you" face. "Mom, Grandma Rosalind's house has been empty for decades. It's probably falling apart. You cannot seriously be thinking about—" "I'm going Thursday," Eleanor said pleasantly. "You're welcome to come if you'd like." She could feel Patricia's stare on her back as she walked toward her car. It felt like sunshine. The drive from the city to Crestwood took just under 2 hours, through landscape that shifted gradually from dense suburban development to something older and quieter. Hills rose and softened. Stone walls appeared alongside roads, built by hands long gone from this world, marking boundaries that time had long since dissolved. Eleanor drove with her window partially down, despite the November cold, breathing air that smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, and something she couldn't name, but recognized as the scent of a place she'd loved before she'd had the vocabulary to say so. She hadn't been to Crestwood in decades. She'd been 23 the last time she'd visited her grandmother here, young and impatient and full of the conviction that the important things were happening elsewhere. She remembered a town that felt like it had been assembled from the most essential components of small-town life and left to ripen slowly, unhurried by progress. It was still there. Smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply measuring it against a larger frame of reference now, but still present and recognizable. A main street with a hardware store, a bakery with steamed-up windows, a bookshop whose sign looked like it had been hand-painted sometime in the 1970s, and never replaced because it was still perfectly legible, and why fix what isn't broken. A diner on the corner with a chalkboard in the window, advertising the day's soup. A small library with stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Eleanor parked on the main street and sat for a moment, remembering. She'd sat on those library steps with her grandmother when she was 9 years old, eating apples from Rosalind's garden, while her grandmother told her stories about the women in their family going back 4 generations. Strong women, Rosalind had said. Women who knew their own worth even when the world was busy telling them otherwise. She got out of the car and walked to the bakery, because it seemed like the right place to start, and because the smell coming through the door was extraordinary. A woman about Eleanor's own age was arranging pastries behind the glass counter with the concentrated attention of someone who takes beauty seriously. "You must be passing through," the woman said, looking up with genuine curiosity rather than the professional friendliness of someone trained to welcome strangers. "We don't get many visitors in November." "Actually," Eleanor said, "I'm going to the Voss property, on Old Meadow Road. I own it. My grandmother left it to me." The woman put down the tray she was holding very slowly. She studied Eleanor for a long moment with an expression that shifted through several emotions Eleanor couldn't entirely read. Then she said, "You're Rosalind's granddaughter, Ellie." Eleanor felt something move through her chest, warm and unexpected. "Yes," she said, "though it's been a very long time since anyone called me that." "My name is Frances Beaumont," the woman said. "Rosalind was my neighbor for 27 years, and my dearest friend for all of them. She talked about you constantly. She said you'd come when you were ready. She said it might take a while, but that you'd come." Eleanor sat down on one of the bakery stools because her legs had decided the conversation called for sitting. "She talked about me," she said. "She never stopped," Frances said. "Come, I'll make you coffee and we'll talk before you go to the house. There are things you should know before you see it." Over coffee and something Frances called a cardamom roll that was so good, Eleanor ate 2 of them without noticing. She learned that her grandmother had not simply left her a house. Rosalind Voss had spent the last 15 years of her life quietly and methodically preparing that house for Eleanor, with the patience of someone who understood that love expressed in practical terms outlasts love expressed in sentiment. "She knew you'd go through difficult things," Frances said. She said it was in your nature to choose people who needed you more than they deserved you. She said she hoped she was wrong, but she wanted to be prepared in case she was right. So she started preparing. Prepared how? Eleanor asked. Frances smiled, the slow smile of a woman keeping a beautiful secret that she's finally allowed to share. You'll see, she said. But I'll tell you this much. Your grandmother was a clever woman, Ellie. She loved you in the most practical way possible. She built you a future, and then she wrapped it in an old house and waited for you to need it. The road to the Voss property wound away from town through bare November trees, their branches making complicated patterns against a sky the particular gray of old pewter. Eleanor drove slowly, not from caution, but from something that felt like ceremony, like approaching something that deserved to be approached with intention. She almost missed the entrance. The gate was wooden, weathered silver gray, almost invisible against the line of stone wall that bordered the property. But there it was, standing open as if it had been expecting her. The driveway was overgrown, grass growing up through gravel that had mostly disappeared into the earth, but the bones of it were still there, curving through a stand of old maples toward a house that Eleanor could see glinting through the bare branches. Her breath caught when she rounded the last curve and saw it properly. The house was not falling down. Eleanor had prepared herself for ruin, for the particular sadness of a beautiful thing that had been allowed to deteriorate past the point of recovery. But the house that stood before her was something else entirely. Old, certainly. Probably built in the late 1800s, a clapboard farmhouse with a deep porch running the full length of the front, dormers pushing up through a slate roof that looked, impossibly, intact. The paint was weathered, the porch needed work, the garden had gone entirely to wilderness, but the structure was sound. She could see it in the way it sat on its foundation, the confidence of a building that knows its own bones. More than that, the property itself was extraordinary. She'd forgotten how much land her grandmother had owned here. The house sat in a clearing of perhaps 2 acres, but the property extended far beyond that, into what looked like old orchard, meadow, and eventually the kind of mature forest that takes generations to grow. Through the bare trees on the east side of the property, she could see the glint of water, a pond or perhaps the small stream she remembered from childhood visits. She sat in her car for a long moment, 88 years old, and alone on a November afternoon, looking at something her grandmother had kept for her for decades, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that she'd almost forgotten its name. She felt possibility. The key Frances had given her before she left the bakery, copied from Rosalind's original, turned easily in the front door lock. The door swung open with a creak that sounded less like neglect and more like announcement. Inside, Eleanor stood very still and breathed. The interior was dusty, certainly, and cold, and filled with the particular stillness of an uninhabited space. But it was not ruined. The wide plank floors were dirty but intact. The plaster walls had cracks but were fundamentally sound. The massive brick fireplace that dominated the main room had its original ironwork still in place, and when Eleanor peered up the chimney, she could see daylight at the top, clear and unobstructed. The kitchen had an old cast-iron stove, and deep stone sink and wooden counters worn smooth by decades of work. The windows, those original wavy glass panes, were intact in almost every frame. And then she saw what else the house contained, and she stopped breathing entirely for a moment. Her grandmother's paintings were everywhere. Eleanor had known Rosalind painted, had seen the canvases that decorated her home during childhood visits, but she hadn't understood the scale of the work until this moment. The walls were covered, canvas after canvas, landscapes of this very property in different seasons and different light, portraits of women Eleanor recognized from old family photographs, abstract pieces in colors so rich and alive they seemed to generate their own warmth. There were paintings stacked against walls and stored in the bedrooms upstairs, and filling a studio at the back of the house that Eleanor discovered when she pushed open a door she'd thought was a closet. The studio was the most extraordinary room in the house. Its north wall was almost entirely windows, facing a view of the old orchard, and in November's flat light, the room was nevertheless luminous, filled with a quality of illumination that painters spend lifetimes chasing. Her grandmother's supplies were still here, organized with the meticulous care of a serious artist. Brushes cleaned and stored, paints in their cases, canvases both blank and completed, stacked in careful order. In the center of the work table sat an envelope. Ellie, in Rosalind's handwriting, the letters strong and uncompromising, the hand of a woman who never learned to make herself small even on a page. Eleanor sat down on her grandmother's paint-stained stool and opened it with hands that were entirely steady. She was 88 years old and had weathered more than enough life to face whatever this letter contained, though she suspected from the warm feeling expanding in her chest that whatever it contained was not something to be feared. My dearest Ellie, the letter began. If you're reading this, something difficult has happened and you finally come home. I'm glad. I've been waiting for you. I want to explain some things I couldn't tell you while I was alive, or more accurately, things I chose not to tell you, because I didn't want to influence the choices you were making. You needed to live your life without your grandmother's voice in your ear at every turn, but I watched, and I paid attention, and I prepared. This property has been in our family for 112 years. My grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, Clara Voss, purchased it with her own money in 1877, money she earned painting botanical illustrations for a medical publisher in Albany when women weren't supposed to earn anything at all. She left it to my mother, who left it to me, who is leaving it to you. Every woman in our line who has held this property has held it the same way, with clear title, no debt, and no man's name on the deed. That is not an accident. That is a tradition I have very deliberately continued. The property consists of the house and its immediate grounds, 73 acres of land including the old orchard, the meadow, the pond, and the mature forest to the north. When I had it assessed in 1987, it was worth approximately $240,000. I imagine it is worth considerably more now, particularly given that the Hudson Valley land market has changed considerably since then. But I would encourage you not to sell it, Ellie. Not because of its monetary value, but because of what it could become. In my studio, you'll find approximately 340 paintings created over 60 years of working in this space. I never tried very hard to sell them because I never needed the money, and because frankly most of them aren't for sale, they're for you. However, a gallery in Hudson has expressed serious interest in my work over the years, and there is a letter in the top drawer of my studio desk from the owner, a woman named Margaret Cho, who visited me 3 times and told me on her last visit that she believed my work was significantly undervalued and that a proper retrospective could change that. Her letter is dated 1988, so she may no longer be at that address, but I believe the interest was genuine. I'm also leaving you the contents of the cedar chest in the master bedroom. Please look at it carefully. I think you'll find it instructive. The house needs work, certainly. The bones are excellent. I had the foundation inspected in 1985 and the roof replaced in 1984. It should be sound for many more years. The well produces clean, good water. The septic system was replaced in 1983. I've been as practical as I know how to be, Ellie, because I understand that love without practicality is just sentiment. What I hope you'll do with this place is live in it. Actually live in it. Not as a caretaker or a visitor, but as a woman who has finally arrived at her own life after spending a great deal of time in someone else's. You are, I imagine, somewhere between 70 and 100 years old as you read this, which means by any reasonable calculation, you have years ahead of you. Don't waste them being careful and small. You've been careful and small long enough. The women in our family have always known something that the world has tried very hard to convince us isn't true. That we are at our most powerful not when we are young, but when we have finally lived long enough to stop being afraid. You're not too old, Ellie. You're ready. There is a significant difference. I love you more than words in any letter could contain. Welcome home. All my love always. Your grandmother Rosalind. Eleanor read the letter 4 times. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest for a long moment, looking out the studio windows at the bare orchard against the gray November sky. Then she got up, found a relatively clean cloth among her grandmother's supplies, wiped a clear space on the work table, sat back down, and began making a list. She stayed in a bed and breakfast in Crestwood that first night, a cheerful Victorian house run by a couple in their 60s who fed her an enormous breakfast and didn't ask any questions beyond what she needed to be comfortable. The next morning she went back to the property with Frances Beaumont, who turned out to possess the most useful combination of practical knowledge and local connections Eleanor had ever encountered in a single person. Frances knew the best contractor in the county, a quiet man named Ben Torres, who had rebuilt half the historic homes in the Hudson Valley and who came to walk through the Voss house that same afternoon. He moved through the rooms with his hands touching walls and his eyes measuring angles and his expression shifting through a series of emotions that Eleanor had learned to read as a good sign. Contractors who found ruin looked grim. Ben Torres looked interested. "This is a genuinely fine house," he said finally, standing in the kitchen running a hand along the stone sink. "There's real work to be done. The wiring needs to be completely replaced, The plumbing is marginal at best. The kitchen and bathrooms need updating. The exterior paint is completely gone. He paused. But the structure is extraordinary. They built these things to last 300 years, and she's maybe a third of the way through her lifespan. He looked at Eleanor with the directness of a man who says what he means. This is a project worth doing. What would it cost to make it genuinely livable? Eleanor asked. Not perfect. Livable, safe, and comfortable. Ben Torres thought for a moment, already calculating in the particular way of people who do this work with their whole selves. He named a figure. It was not a small figure, but it was not impossible, and Eleanor had the settlement from Maurice's well-managed accounts and 88 years of understanding exactly how much things cost and what they were worth. She hired him that afternoon. She drove back to the city that evening with the intention of spending 2 weeks sorting out the practical matters of dismantling a life she'd been living in the wrong direction. She would collect her things, store what needed storing, sell what needed selling, and close the chapter that had been quietly strangling her for 21 years. She told herself this would take 2 weeks. It took 11 days, which surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. It turns out there isn't as much to dismantle when you're honest about what was actually yours. Patricia appeared on day 4, as Eleanor had known she would, carrying the particular energy of a woman on a rescue mission. She walked through the apartment that Eleanor was systematically unpacking from the marriage and watched her mother with an expression that moved between admiration and terror, which Eleanor found touching. "You're really doing this," Patricia said, sitting on a box of Maurice's books that hadn't been collected yet. "I really am. Mom, you're 88. Crestwood is 2 hours from the city. If anything happened to you..." "Things happen to people in cities too," Eleanor said. "Things happen to me in this city, as it turns out." Patricia was quiet for a moment, watching Eleanor wrap picture frames in newspaper. Then she said, "Grandma Rosalind's house. I remember going there when I was little. Just once, I think. I remember a smell, something floral, like she was always baking something with lavender. She grew lavender along the whole south side of the house," Eleanor said. "It came back wild after she died. It's all along the foundation still, just completely overgrown." Patricia picked at the corner of the packing tape. "I remember she had that enormous garden, and the pond with the frogs. The pond is still there." Eleanor paused in her wrapping and looked at her daughter. "Come see it. When Ben Torres has made some progress on the house, come up for a weekend." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue and thought better of it. "Okay," she said finally, in the voice of someone making a genuine concession. "Show me what you're building." What Eleanor was building turned out to be considerably more than she'd originally planned, which was perhaps inevitable, given that her grandmother had been ambitious on her behalf in ways Eleanor was only beginning to understand. The cedar chest in the master bedroom contained, as Rosalind had promised, something instructive. Specifically, it contained 70 years of meticulous financial records, correspondence with attorneys and financial advisors, property documents, and in a sealed envelope at the bottom of the chest, a handwritten inventory of every painting in the studio with Rosalind's own assessment of each piece and what she believed it was worth. Eleanor was not a financial professional, but she'd lived 88 years and raised children and managed households and survived 2 marriages, which constitutes a certain kind of advanced education in how money and value actually work. She sat with those records for an entire evening and understood several things clearly by the end of it. Her grandmother had been, beneath the artist's paint-stained exterior, a remarkably shrewd manager of what she had. The property was owned free and clear with a small fund established to cover property taxes for decades after Rosalind's death. The paintings in the studio, based on Rosalind's own conservative assessments of 1988 values, represented something significant. 3.5 decades of appreciation in both the art market and in Rosalind's posthumous reputation, which Eleanor didn't yet know the current state of, might represent something considerably more significant. She called the gallery in Hudson from Rosalind's letter and discovered that Margaret Cho had retired 8 years ago, but that her daughter Anna now ran the gallery and was familiar with Rosalind Voss's work in the way serious gallery owners are familiar with artists whose moment hasn't quite arrived yet, but whose work they've been watching carefully. "I've been hoping someone would contact me about her estate," Anna said on the phone, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone trying not to oversell. The interest in her work has been growing. She was part of a generation of American women painters who worked largely outside the mainstream and who are only now receiving serious critical attention. A proper retrospective, with good documentation and the right institutional partnerships, could be very significant. How significant, Eleanor said, because at 88 she didn't have time to circle around things. Anna was quiet for a moment. If the work is as extensive as I understand it to be, and if the quality holds throughout, which based on what I've seen I believe it will, we could be talking about a major revaluation of her catalog. Individual works in the range she was painting are currently selling at auction for prices that would have seemed impossible 15 years ago. A retrospective exhibition could establish a market that transforms the value of the entire collection. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. She thought about her grandmother, working alone in that Northlit studio for 60 years, painting the world as she saw it, with no particular concern for whether the world was looking back. She thought about Rosalind's letter. I never tried very hard to sell them because I never needed the money. She thought about what her grandmother had actually left her and understood suddenly and completely that it wasn't a house with some paintings in it. It was a legacy that had been quietly accruing value for decades, waiting for someone with the clarity to recognize it and the freedom to act. I'd like to meet with you as soon as possible, Eleanor said. I believe my grandmother left me a great deal more than I initially understood. Ben Torres's crew began work on the house in early December, and Eleanor began spending 3 days a week in Crestwood, staying at the bed and breakfast when the work made the house uninhabitable. She thought she would find the construction process stressful, all that noise and disruption and decision-making in the cold of a Hudson Valley winter. Instead, she found it invigorating in a way nothing had been invigorating in years. There was a pleasure in decisions that were entirely her own, in choosing colors and fixtures and layouts with reference to nobody's preferences but her own, in building something that would bear only her mark. Frances became her daily companion in Crestwood, a role Frances seemed to have been waiting for. She knew everyone in town and introduced Eleanor with the proprietary pride of a woman presenting something she'd been guarding. "This is Rosalind's granddaughter," she'd say, and Eleanor would watch people's faces shift into expressions of warmth and recognition, connected through her grandmother to a community she'd never known she belonged to. The town had loved Rosalind Voss. Eleanor learned this gradually through dozens of small stories, each one adding another dimension to a woman Eleanor had known as grandmother, but was only now beginning to understand as a full human being. Rosalind had funded the restoration of the town's Civil War memorial with no fanfare. She taught informal drawing classes to anyone in town who wanted to learn, holding them in her studio on Saturday mornings for 30 years. She'd organized the Historical Society, cataloged the town's architectural heritage, written a self-published book about the region's natural plant communities that was apparently still the definitive reference work. She built things, Frances told Eleanor one evening over dinner at the diner, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the obvious. She built things that lasted. That was just how she thought. If you're going to do something, build it to outlast you. Eleanor understood, hearing those words, that she was her grandmother's granddaughter in ways she'd never fully appreciated, and that it was not too late to act like it. The retrospective opened in April at Anna Cho's gallery in Hudson, in the largest space Anna had, and still the paintings filled every wall and overflowed into a secondary room. Eleanor had spent 3 months working with Anna and an art historian named Dr. Patricia Ling, who'd written her doctoral thesis on the generation of American women painters to which Rosalind belonged, to catalog, document, and contextualize the work properly. It was the most sustained intellectual engagement Eleanor had experienced since, she was startled to realize, her own graduate work in landscape architecture 50 years ago, work she'd set aside when her first marriage required her to be in one place and support someone else's career. She stood on the opening night in a gallery full of people who'd come from New York and Boston and as far as Chicago to see the work, and she felt something expand in her chest that she recognized as pride. Not pride in herself exactly, though there was some of that, but pride in Rosalind, in all those decades of work in the Northlit studio, in the refusal to stop creating regardless of whether the world was paying attention. The reviews were extraordinary. Within a month, 2 major museum curators had been in contact about institutional loans. A collector from California purchased 6 paintings at prices that made Eleanor sit down and breathe carefully when Anna called to tell her. The catalog Anna had produced sold out its first printing and went into a second. Eleanor took her portion of the proceeds and added it to Ben Torres's budget. She was doing more to the house than she'd originally planned, which was also, perhaps, inevitable. The studio she left essentially as Rosalind had designed it, because it was already perfect for what Eleanor intended. She was painting again herself, something she hadn't done since her 20s, and she discovered in returning to it that she had more facility than she'd remembered, that the hand retains what the mind thinks it's forgotten. She worked in the early mornings before the light shifted, painting the same orchard and meadow and pond that her grandmother had painted for 60 years, finding her own relationship to a landscape she was only beginning to truly know. She turned the barn on the eastern edge of the property, a large post and beam structure that Ben Torres declared structurally magnificent, into a studio and workshop space. Not just for herself, but for other women, because one morning sitting in Rosalind's chair, she'd had a thought that arrived with the particular clarity of something that had been waiting quietly for exactly the right moment. Her grandmother had built this property as a sanctuary for one woman, Eleanor herself, with decades of patient preparation. Eleanor would build it as a sanctuary for many, which is what she believed Rosalind had really meant when she said, "Don't waste your years being careful and small." She designed it carefully, using the landscape architecture training that had been sitting in her memory for 50 years, like a seed waiting for the right conditions. She mapped the existing natural features, the pond, the stream, the old orchard whose trees she'd had expertly pruned back to productive health, the meadow that bloomed in May with wildflowers she hadn't planted, but received as gifts from the generations of work that had gone into this soil before her. She designed around what was already there, rather than imposing something new on top of it. What she was creating was a residency program for women artists over 60, a place where women who'd spent decades raising families, supporting partners, keeping institutions running while someone else got the credit could come and work without interruption for 2 weeks at a time, with good food and good company, and no obligations to anyone but their own creative work. She called it Rosalind's, which Frances told her was exactly right. Patricia came for a weekend in June, as she'd promised, and Eleanor watched her daughter walk through the transformed property with an expression that shifted and shifted again. The house had been completely restored by then, every surface considered, every space made to feel both historic and genuinely comfortable. The gardens were in their first season of intentional cultivation. Beds Eleanor had designed along the south wall, where Rosalind's lavender grew wild and abundant, perfuming the whole property on warm afternoons. The pond had been cleared and the old dock rebuilt, and the orchard was in full leaf, the trees that had been neglected for 30 years now professionally managed, and already showing the first tentative signs of returning productivity. "It's beautiful," Patricia said quietly, standing in the middle of the orchard with the late afternoon light coming through the leaves. She sounded slightly undone, which was unusual for Patricia. "I didn't understand what you were doing." "I know," Eleanor said. "I thought you were being impulsive. Running away from the situation with Maurice by throwing yourself into some project. I thought it was grief, or denial, or—" She stopped. Eleanor waited. "I thought you needed to be protected from yourself," Patricia said. "I've been thinking that for years, actually. That you needed managing." She shook her head. "Grandma Rosalind never needed managing." "No," Eleanor said. "She didn't." "You're like her," Patricia said. "I always knew that, but I never really understood what it meant until now." She looked at Eleanor directly. "I'm sorry I tried to put you in assisted living." Eleanor laughed. "You were trying to help. You were frightened for me." "I was frightened of the inconvenience," Patricia said honestly. "Of you needing things I didn't know how to provide, of watching you diminish." She gestured around at the orchard, the property, the distant glint of the pond. She looked at her mother with something Eleanor recognized after a moment as genuine admiration. "You're not diminishing." "Not even slightly," Eleanor agreed. The first residency session at Rosalind's began in September, 7 women ranging in age from 61 to 78. A sculptor, 2 painters, a printmaker, a textile artist, a poet, and a ceramicist who'd spent 30 years teaching at a community arts center before finally, at 69, beginning to make her own work seriously. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, and Eleanor fed them dinner on the long porch overlooking the garden, and they talked until midnight with the particular intensity of people who've been waiting a very long time to be in exactly this kind of company. Eleanor listened as much as she talked, and she thought about her grandmother feeding her apples on the library steps and telling her stories about strong women, and she understood that what Rosalind had really been doing was preparing her for this, for the day when Eleanor would be the one telling the stories. She was 88 years old. She rose at 6 every morning to paint in the north-lit studio before the light shifted. She walked the full perimeter of the property 3 times a week with Frances, who'd taken to spending as much time at Rosalind's as she spent at her own house in town. She attended the small white church with the worn wooden pews where her grandmother had attended for 30 years, and she was greeted by name with the particular warmth of a community that understood it had received someone who intended to stay. She had dinners with Ben Torres and his wife, who'd become genuine friends. She corresponded with Anna Cho and Dr. Patricia Ling about the ongoing work of properly establishing Rosalind's legacy in the art historical record. She was, she sometimes thought with a startled pleasure, busier and more engaged, and more genuinely useful than she'd been in 30 years of being someone's wife. Maurice had called twice in the months since the settlement. The first time, she'd let it go to voicemail. The second time she'd answered, and they'd had a short conversation that was remarkably civilized, during which Morris had asked how she was doing with what sounded like genuine curiosity. She'd told him, briefly, and he'd been quiet for a moment, and then said, "I think you're going to be all right, Eleanor. More than all right." "I know," she'd said. "I've known for a while now." On an evening in late October, Eleanor sat on the porch of her grandmother's house, watching the last light of the day move through the maples that lined the drive, turning them shades of amber and copper and the particular deep red that has no better name than maple red. Frances was beside her with a glass of wine. The residency guests had gone home 2 weeks earlier, and the property had settled into the comfortable stillness of a place between chapters. Eleanor had been thinking, as she often did in these quiet hours, about Rosalind's letter, about the phrase that had struck her most forcefully, not when she first read it, but in the weeks that followed when she understood it more fully. "You are at your most powerful not when you are young, but when you have finally lived long enough to stop being afraid." She thought about the 88 years she'd lived, the choices that had been brave and the ones that had been made out of accommodation, the things she'd set aside and the things she'd carried, the marriages, both of them, and what they'd asked her to be, the work she'd put down in her 20s when life required it, and the work she'd picked back up in the North-lit studio at 88, with hands that remembered what she'd thought they'd forgotten. She thought about her grandmother working in this studio for 60 years, unknown and unbothered by her unknownness, building something that would outlast her. She thought about the cedar chest with its practical documentation of love, the fund established to cover property taxes, the careful inventory of paintings with their careful, honest assessments, the letter that said, "I've been preparing this for you. I knew you'd need it eventually. I knew you were worth preparing for." She thought about Patricia standing in the orchard with light in her hair, saying, "You're not diminishing," and about the 7 women who'd sat on this porch 2 weeks ago and talked until midnight with the energy of people who'd been waiting their whole lives for exactly this conversation. She thought about the lavender along the south wall that her grandmother had planted, and that had continued growing wild and abundant for 35 years without being asked to, because lavender, once established in the right soil, simply does that. "You're quiet," Frances said. "Thinking," Eleanor said. "What about?" She considered the question. About how long it takes to become who you're supposed to be. About how that's not a failure of the earlier years. Those years still count. They still build the thing. She paused. About how my grandmother knew something I had to live 88 years to understand myself. Frances looked at her sideways. "And what's that?" "That the right life doesn't end," Eleanor said. "It begins, again and again, as many times as you're willing to let it." She looked at the maples, the amber light, the long shadows moving across the old grass. "My grandmother began 4 times that I can count. She just didn't make a fuss about it. She sat in that studio and kept working and kept building, and she left me everything she built so I could begin too." The maples held their light for another long moment and then let it go, the way beautiful things do, knowing it will come back tomorrow. Eleanor Voss was 88 years old. She was 3 months into the first year of her actual life, and she had never, not in any of the decades before this one, been less afraid. In the morning she would rise at 6 and paint in the North-lit studio, and walk the orchard, and write letters to the women who'd already applied for the spring residency session, and have coffee with Frances, and read and tend the lavender that her grandmother had planted along the south wall, and that grew, as lavender does in the right soil, with absolutely no intention of stopping. That was enough. That was everything. That was, she understood now at 88, with the clarity that only 88 years can provide, exactly what it had always been meant to be.